Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm super excited you're here with me because we're going to be talking about picking out threads for your quilt, and it's going to be a lot of information. I am super excited about it. I have spent the last 2 days putting together today's presentation, and I hope that you like it. In fact, I put together a downloadable PDF version of today's chat, so if you want to later on go download that and have it to refer to, you definitely can. Just check the link in the description box below. It's totally free. The only payment I ask is if you like the downloadable PDF that you give the video a thumbs up or leave me a comment letting me know that. It also just helps other people on YouTube find my video. So very excited about that. Before we get to today's topic of conversation, a couple of announcements. Betty Beatty had asked about our shops retreat. So I want to tell you about some upcoming events that's going on. So in September, I think it's the 17th through the 19th, Quilting is My Therapy Quilt Shop is hosting our semi-annual retreat. It's going to be lots of fun. We have a beautiful event center that we have it at, and it's basically a relaxed, you bring what you want, you sew what you like, and hang out with other people, and then we'll have demos and other fun stuff too. So if you're in the Kansas City area and you want to stop by, I hope you will, or if you're driving through, I hope you'll stop by. Also was questions about the next Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. I know you guys are excited about it. It's coming soon. I'm putting the final touches on the panel and what I'm going to teach. Cannot wait to share details. And you know I always give you all sneak peeks first. So as soon as I have that stuff together, you know I'm going to let you know. So hopefully in the next month-ish, definitely trying to get that together for you. So very, very excited. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about threads, and it's funny because on the video before I went live, we were kind of text chatting with everybody that was already there, and people were like, oh, I buy all the threads, I love threads. I'd have to say that I'm pretty sure I'm the most thread addicted quilter out there. I mean, not that it's a competition, but we recently just bought all the Glide thread colors and put them on our website. So all the beautiful threads, look at that. I love going into our little e-commerce fulfillment room and looking at all the colors. So if you're in need of some Glide thread or a Glide thread card, we have those on the website, all the colors. It's just great because if I'm looking at challenge stuff, I can go pick out my threads and pet them all. It's too much fun. In fact, that is today's promotion or this week's deal for the live chat. We have buy 3, get 1 free on the Glide thread. So you can use the promo code THREAD when checking out. So buy 3, get 1 free. And I'm going to be talking a lot about Glide threads. So by the time we're done, you might want to pick some up. Now, as I get into our presentation and start showing things, if you have questions, definitely type them out. I've got Jessica here. She is writing furiously. She'll write them all down for me. I can make sure that we address them for you live. So lots of fun. Plus, lots of questions came up before we even started. So lots of topics to talk about. So what we're going to do without any more hesitation, let's jump right into our slideshow, a little presentation about picking out thread colors. For some reason, some people find this a little intimidating. Probably the reason I don't is I've done it a lot. I've quilted a lot of quilts. I've picked out a lot of thread, and so I actually enjoy it. I love pulling out the threads and looking at all the things and, you know, brainstorming what we're going to put on there. And so hopefully I can share with you some tips and ideas to make it easier for you. But I do have to pause and just say there's no wrong answer. You're going to do what you like, just like what color fabric you should use for your quilt. But if you're like, I want to know some practical steps, I bet you might find this helpful. So let's get into it. First of all, I do have a process. As I sat down and was kind of thinking about what I do, I thought, oh my gosh, I do follow this same kind of process. You don't have to follow the same thing. I'm just telling you this is what works for me, but you can definitely start there and make it your own process as well. So when I'm looking at a quilt, top to quilt, the first thing I do is I select at least 3 thread options. Even if I'm pretty sure it's going to be a particular color, I'm going to make myself try some different options, and I'm going to try 3 reasonable options. I mean, these are like the most obvious colors that you probably would pick. Now, we're actually going to use a quilt that I quilted this week. This is a sneak peek. This is going to be an upcoming Midnight Quilter and an upcoming thing at our shop, but it's a cute little wall hanging that says home. And before I quilted it, I took pictures of me picking out the threads so you can see that process. So looking at the unquilted home quilt, we have some gray, we have some light gray, and some blue. So I pulled out 3 reasonable thread options. I have a blue there, a lighter blue. I have a light gray. It's actually Bone Glide, one of my favorites. And then I have a medium kind of gray. So once I have my 3, reasonable thread colors, then I'm going to pick 2 wild cards. This is where I kind of force myself to pick things that probably won't be used, but it lets me start kind of thinking outside the box. And this is actually a question that Fuzzy Face brought up. Fuzzy Face said, what do you do when you have too many threads? Well, maybe giving yourself a number to pick kind of helps. So there I picked out 2 wild cards. So I went to my stash and I thought, ooh, I do like a light pink. We'll see this in some of the pictures I show you. But I also picked out a light green. And I thought, well, let's just throw these 2 out here and see. So I always have at least 5 that I'm kind of looking through, and I'm auditioning it. So once I have those threads picked, though, I'm going to take them off of the spool, and I'm going to audition them or look at them on the lightest and darkest fabrics. I mean, I kind of want to see them over all the things, but definitely I want to see what's it going to look like on the darkest and the lightest. Now, I tried really hard to get some up-close pictures, and you can kind of see, but you know, we're looking at fine threads, so it's difficult. But here, since the background is the lightest and the letter H is the darkest, I'm kind of seeing, okay, what does it look like here? What am I thinking? Then I can start making my decision. I can start ruling colors out. And if we go to the next picture, we can kind of see these 2 quickly were canceled. They were kicked to the side. The gray was a little too dark, especially in that light. I didn't want it being so dark in the background that it distracted from the H or the letters. And then the blue was just, I don't know, not the right shade. It was just a little too bright, a little too blue. So instantly I can knock those out. And then I start kind of working my way through the different ones. Okay, well, which one's gonna work out? So these are the 3 that are left, the pink, the green, and the whitish gray. And I decided, well, I'm gonna leave the pink out. I'm gonna remove that one. It's just a little too light, and I thought, you know, I'll just stay away from that. So it left me with 2 options. The green, the pale mist, which is one of my favorites, and then the bone. And honestly, both of these would have worked fine. There's really, when you get to this point, they're both gonna work fine, but then you have to start kind of thinking, you know, what do I want the quilting to do? Do I want it to show up just a bit? Do I want it to hide how much light is in the quilt versus dark? And so after the 2, I finally made my choice, and I quilted my quilt. So here is the quilt, a couple up-close pictures. Again, if you want to download that PDF, you can check that out a little bit closer if you'd like. And so what color do you think that I used? You know, you're like, well, both of them are fine. I actually went with the pale mist. So just that light shade of green was just the perfect, I don't know, it just looked really cool on the blue. It didn't show up too much, and it wasn't so dark that it showed up a lot on the background. But it really kind of added a lot to the quilt. So sometimes the thread color that you think isn't necessarily the one that you're gonna go with. So that's kind of why I forced myself to try some different options. Now, we're gonna kind of go through some more examples, and we'll talk about, I mean, lots of quilted pictures of stuff, and I'll talk about what I was thinking when I picked it. But again, you have to know that there's no right or wrong answer. This is just kind of what I was going with. So as I sat down and started putting together all my thoughts about picking out thread color, I started kind of thinking about my rules. And I put these in quotes because they're not really rules, they're just habits I have, just things I tend to do. And as I was thinking through, like, well, maybe you might find this helpful. One of my rules or habits is I rarely use white or black thread when machine quilting. Okay, you might think, but what if the quilt has a lot of white? For the most part, unless it's a solid piece of white fabric, there's going to be other colors on there, and sometimes the white or black can be too stark on the rest of the quilt. And it's really hard to see white thread on white fabric and black thread on black fabric. So instead, I actually opt for a light yellow for instead of white, or a light neutral, maybe like a light off-white, and a dark gray for black. So those would be my substitutes. You might be surprised, I mean, if you've heard me talk in any amount of time, you probably already know this, but if this is your first time hanging out or listening to this, you might be surprised and think light yellow, that doesn't make any sense. But it's light enough to, you know, not be too stark against lighter backgrounds, but it has just enough color that it doesn't stand out too much on other fabrics. So let me show you some different options on actual quilts. But I will say that my rule is, if I can't decide between 2 colors, if I've brought it down to 2 and I can't decide which one to pick, I almost always go for the lightest color. I'd rather have light thread on dark fabric than vice versa. So if you're kind of on the fence, go a little bit lighter, because I just think it looks better. Again, that's just my rule. So let's look at some quilts and talk about thread color. So this is a perfect example of a multicolored quilt. It's a tumbling block that Tula Pink did. It was in our book, Quilting with Angela, or Tula and Angela. And it's a pretty light background, but there's so many other colors. And this is actually quilted in light yellow thread. So again, it doesn't show up too much on the wider area, and just that little bit of color keeps it from being too stark on the other colors. So a perfect example and a little bit closer up. Now, what's great about thread is it kind of takes on the fabric that it's next to, especially if you're using 40 weight glide or 50 weight thread, that little bit thinner, it almost takes on the color it's next to. So sometimes you have to know, like, it might look one way, but when you quilt it, it's going to look even better than you thought. And another example, again, yellow thread, going over a range of fabrics. So this particular quilt, there's a lot of light background, but then there's some of that dark colors there, and I knew that I didn't want to switch out threads, and I also knew that I was going to quilt it so that group them together. And so knowing that it's going to show up a little bit, I knew it would be fine on the darker. Now, if it had been flipped, if there was a lot more dark and a lot less light, then of course I probably would have went with a different color. But it's going to be your go-to color. And so again, the yellow, even though it's glide, it has a little bit of a sheen, just a hint of sheen. I love the way it looks. It's not too stark on there, and that's, again, the light yellow. I like Yellow Whisper, Lemon Ice, any of the light yellows will work. I'm going to show you at the end kind of like what I suggest for your starter pack of thread, but light yellow is definitely on the list. And I kind of kept putting pictures of light yellow, and I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to stop adding so many pictures, but I threw this one in too. It's a quilt for Tula Pink. Again, a lot of different colors, but the background, the fabrics are a little busier and the background is lighter, so I did the light yellow in this one as well. Now, that doesn't mean that I'll use it over the whole quilt. If needed, I will change thread colors, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But if you're forced to pick one thread color, looking at those different areas and picking, the lighter option is usually the best bet. But I don't always use yellow, so rules are made to be broken. So even though they're my rules, I still break them. And this Quilt Love quilt is a perfect example of that. So if you're looking at a quilt and you're trying to audition colors, in fact, a lot of people were saying in the chat, like, I want to branch out, I want to get braver, and I want to try other thread colors. Well, I said, what's your favorite color on the quilt? Well, this quilt is obviously a lot of pink, and I love pink. So I opted to quilt it. Well, actually, I didn't quilt this one. This one was quilted at the shop, but she used a light pink thread. Just a hint of that color, just a little bit hint. It doesn't stand out too much on the background. It blends into the letters, and it just, I don't know, a little hint of that color to it. So it doesn't even have to be a light yellow, light pink, light green. We're going to see that again in my little starter kit that I was going to tell you about, but definitely some of my favorite colors. But I do use white sometimes. So sometimes I do, like, that's breaking the rules. I'll use white thread, white glide, if I need the quilting to blend in, and it's going to be a very fussy, very, a thread heavy design, or if I'm working on a gray background. Maybe I want that contrast, a little bit of contrast, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I don't want to go darker because I don't usually like to go darker, so adding white on the gray is going to give me that contrast. So this particular quilt for Tula Pink, I decided I was going to do lots of swirls, and I was going to incorporate some cross hatching. And so I'm like, okay, I'm not going to use really contrasting thread here because I'm not much of a cross hatcher, but we'll try it out. And so what it's going to do is it's going to give me just a little bit of contrast, just a little bit of beautiful texture without overwhelming it. Again, the light yellow would have worked out as well, but I just decided to go with the white. I loved how it just looked on there. So just know that if you have a way you do things, you can always change it up, especially depending on each quilt. And I knew that since there was so much traveling, a lot of traveling and echoing, I wanted to make sure that it didn't overwhelm the top. So I went with just the white glide. That little bit of sheen helps you see it, but keeps it from, being too overwhelming to the quilt. And you can see there. And then if I need to change threads, and we'll talk about that here in a second, I will. But for the most part, I know that white can work on a range of colors, even the lighter ones. So it looks real fun. And so sometimes I'll use white, sometimes I'll use black. So again, another quilt for Tula Pink. I didn't have the full shot. Sorry about that. It was like a big circle with wedges. And when you're looking at threads and picking designs, you really have to think, okay, what's the most important thing about this quilt and how am I going to show it off? And as much as Tula loves me and loves my quilting, she's really not trying to promote my quilting skills, right? She's trying to sell her fabric. And so I knew I didn't want the quilting to take away from all those beautiful prints that were around there. So I opted for just black and white to match the fabric. That way I could just do some fun, intricate, crazy quilting without overwhelming it. And so, real quick, there we go, we can see the black in there. So it's really difficult though to see black thread when you're quilting on black fabric. So if you do opt to go that route and you can't see what you're doing, maybe try turning off your overhead light and shining a side light will help you see that shadow. So not all the time do I use black, rarely, but sometimes it makes sense, especially in this particular instance. Okay, so we know now my rules and kind of what I like to do. Let's talk about a couple of different options. Sometimes you're picking out thread colors and you have to pick a single thread color, whether it's an all-over design, whether the way you're gonna quilt it is gonna cross over multiple fabrics. And so what is the rule of thumb for that? And this, actually the question I was asked last week pretty much kicked off this whole topic. And it was like, what if I have a red and white quilt? Which color would I use? So let's talk about picking a single thread color. The best rule of thumb I can give you is to aim for a neutral color in between the values of the quilt. Now, every quilt is different, every fabric is different, but let's say you're doing a red and white quilt with triangles and there's equal amounts of both. What color should you use? Remember, there's no wrong answer, but I would probably go with a neutral, a gray, and I'd probably go in between, so light to medium, but more on the light side because I like to aim to the light. Knowing that it's gonna show up on both, but we're trying to kind of split the difference and keep it from overwhelming. That's pretty much the rule of thumb I use, but let's look at some examples and talk through it. I know this isn't the best picture, but I had to include it. This was actually pieced by my husband's grandpa before he passed away, and it was a quilt that I wanted to quilt to highlight the cornerstones. And so I knew that the design I was gonna go through, let's kind of see the quilting here. The cornerstone in between those blocks was something that Grandpa was known for. Like he always would put cornerstones in between his blocks, make his blocks, put sashing, cornerstones. And so that kind of gave me the inspiration for the design. I wanted the quilting to wrap around those cornerstones. That was just kind of what I was thinking. But since I quilted it that way, I knew I had to pick one thread color. I wasn't gonna change in between each little bit. So I had to find a thread color that would work. Okay, so if we look at this quilt, they're all similar in value, right? There's not a light. I mean, some are a little bit lighter, but for the most part, they're within that same range. So I picked blue because blue happens to be one of my favorite colors. So I opted for a blue thread in a medium value, so a medium blue thread. And that means it's gonna contrast a little bit on the green, a little bit on the red, but it's not that much because it's the same value. So if you remember nothing else from this live chat, you don't remember my funny jokes or my great quilting pictures, remember that we're aiming for a value, right? So you can really get away with some fun stuff. And I think I have another picture right here. So again, that's a blue thread, has a little bit of a sheen, but the reason that it's not distracting is because it's the same value, it's that medium. If I had went lighter or darker, it would have stood out more. And in this particular instance, I didn't necessarily want the quilting to outshine his Amish-inspired quilt pattern. Okay, so also you can think about, what's your favorite color in the block? So this was a Build a Quilt. Build a Quilt is our block of the month, and so this was kind of one of the blocks, and I was quilting it for the Quilt As You Go section. So when you're looking at this quilt, you might think, okay, there's tan, that would work. There's a goldish color, that would work, a light kind of yellow or light gold. But I kind of liked the coral. And when I can get away with using a thread color that's not your norm, that's what I'll do. So when I saw this, I thought, oh, you know what? I'm gonna go with a very light corally kind of color, really pretty, more of a salmon actually. And you can tell in that thinner sashing with those lighter blocks, it does show up a little bit more, but in the background, it doesn't quite show up. It kind of hits that range. So you don't have to always pick, the color you think you have to. You can play around with that. And so a good question to ask yourself when you're picking out threads could be, well, what's my favorite color in the quilt? Here's another example. So this quilt makes me smile. I love this quilt. I think it's called the Modern Bursting Star. And it's just so bright and happy. And I thought, man, I'm normally a blue girl. We know blue is my favorite, but I was pleasantly surprised by how much I loved that lime chartreuse color. So when I was picking out thread, it seemed like an easy pick. I'm gonna go with a green kind of chartreuse. Again, there's not a bunch of lights or darks on here. They're all pretty much within a range. So I knew that I could get away with using that color. So using that kind of chartreuse color in all the areas of the quilt. Now, if I'm going to be doing this, I'm going to know, okay, in the darker diamonds, it's going to show up a little bit more, right? That's just how it is. In those areas, I'm going to keep the quilting a little bit more simple, a little bit more geometric. So why is that? Well, geometric designs usually don't have a lot of traveling on it, so dot to dot, and it just kind of keeps the thread from building up and drawing attention. So if you look in the center, I did some dot to dot and some feathers, I did all this kind of stuff, but in the darker blue diamonds towards the sides of the picture, I just did a basic dot to dot, just something geometric, something nice and easy, as to not let the thread really build up on itself. So if you do have to pick one thread color and you have some contrasting areas, stick with designs that are a little bit more basic. So here you can kind of see that a little bit more. Again, the reason it works, it's the same kind of value, and even though it's contrast, it still looks really good. And I used it in the gray, I used it in all parts of the quilt, and I was super happy with that. Okay, speaking of fun thread colors, I kind of got on a kick where I was using orange on everything. Orange is kind of a neutral. I mean, I guess it's all relative, but it really kind of is a fun pop of color if you want to give your quilting a little different look, especially if it's in the value of the fabrics. So if everything is on the lighter side, I'm going to use a light orange or something more like, coral or salmon, that other color, or I can go darker if I'm working with darker fabrics. But even if I'm using it as an all-over design, so this particular quilt, even though there's a lot of different squares, sorry, it kind of freaked out on me. Whoa. My photos was like freaking out. Even though there's a lot of different blocks here, it's still that same orange. And I thought it was fun how it turned out. Again, a little bit different for me, but it worked out. And the more that you play with your thread colors, the more that you use them, the more you're gonna find out the ones that work for you. And another quilt where I use the orange as well. So don't be afraid to audition those different threads that you think you might not use, because you might be pleasantly surprised by them. So again, more of that. One question came up, and this is really good. I'm going to kind of pause right here. Under what circumstances would I use variegated thread? Now, this is where I kind of feel like people are like, oh my gosh, you're crazy. I don't love variegated thread. I mean, I love it. I love how it looks. I love all thread. But the problem with variegated thread is as it changes colors, I can't control where those colors are falling. So let's look at this quilt. What if I opted for a blue variegated thread? Well, it would look great in the other areas, but in the blue, I might lose parts of that thread, and it's going to be kind of distracting. So the circumstance in which I would use variegated thread is if it was monochromatic, it's like shades of blue or pink or gray, and I would use it on a fabric that is not the same color. So if I were going to quilt a blue quilt, I would maybe go with a gray variegated thread or something like that to add some fun detail. This is definitely going to be for quilts if I want to make more impact with the quilting. But for the most part, when I'm quilting, regular quilts, I want the quilting to kind of blend in and not be the main star, for the most part. Okay, so another example, sometimes you can really go crazy with it. So sometimes I will use contrasting thread, and I'll use even a darker thread in some areas. This is when I want the quilting to show up. Maybe it's for a tutorial, maybe I watched a cool video or listened to a live chat and I want to try it out. And so this particular quilt, I went with a red thread. I don't know why, I just thought it sounded kind of fun. And I knew that the quilting would show up more on certain areas, but it's fine. I knew that, the contrast is what I wanted. I wanted to see the quilting. On the yellow, though, it will kind of show you my thoughts about darker thread. Darker thread on lighter fabric is gorgeous, and you will see it again here in a second, but you don't get a lot of the shadow of the quilting. So it looks just like a line, as opposed to even lighter thread on a darker fabric, you still get that shadow and that texture. So it's very unforgiving. So if you do use contrasting thread that's darker, be very confident in the design you're doing, or very confident that you're gonna love how it turns out, even if you can see every little bit and bobble. And so here you can see it again. So again, try some different colors, have fun with it. This was from the Help How Do I Quilt It challenge, and it had a bunch of different colors, and I just loved the gold. I love the gold, and I knew that even though it was going to show up in the middle, it was fine. That was kind of the main point of this quilt, was to be able to see the quilting. I definitely wouldn't have done that if I didn't want the quilting to show up. So you can definitely use those contrasting colors. If you are wanting to try a contrasting color and you're like, okay, I'm going to try it, aim for the same value. So this is a blue, dark blue quilt, and that gold is just going to look great on it, that gold thread, because it's medium to dark like the fabric. It just looks great. It wouldn't have looked so good if it was if it was way lighter or way darker, right? So kind of aim for the same value. What happens though if it doesn't turn out the way you want it to? That's gonna happen, right? It is gonna happen. You're gonna pick out a thread and you're gonna be like, oh man, it's not what I wanted. So this is actually a quilt I did for Allison Glass, and I started on the bottom right. So that's kind of where I started quilting this, and I picked a thread that I thought would add lovely texture and it would really show off the quilting. But then as I got into it, I was like, I don't know, maybe it's gonna overwhelm her blocks. I count Allison as a friend, so I don't think she's gonna like not be my friend anymore, but I'm thinking maybe if I did this over the whole quilt, it might be too much. So after I got done with that little section, I decided, all right, I'll switch to a thread color that works a little bit better. It blends a little bit more. So now if you look in the middle, I opted for just a slightly darker. So this is one example where picking the lighter option didn't actually work. But then I did it again on the opposite corner, right? So if you do that, just make it look intentional. Once is a mistake, twice is a design choice. So I did it in this corner, so I did it in the other corner, and now it gives you more like a color washed effect. I never told her that's why I quilted it that way, so if she sees this, hopefully, you know, she doesn't mind. But this is a little bit closer up of it. Again, I loved it, but I thought when I stepped back, it might be just a little too much for that quilt, especially since she's probably promoting her fabric. She is promoting her fabric. So you can switch it up. You can definitely change. Don't be afraid to change your plan on the fly, because sometimes you're gonna have to. Okay, so what if you are committed to using multiple threads? You're fine with changing thread colors. Well, we don't have to use a different thread color for every fabric. Let's try to find thread colors that will work over a range of fabrics, right? So kind of like if we were picking a thread for the whole quilt, now we're just kind of looking at a range. And this is a perfect example. This quilt I did for Tula, she showed it on one of her Tuesday talks, and I told her this probably took longer than any quilt I've ever done for her because there was a lot of thread changes. So this came up a lot. What about high contrast fabric? Okay, if I was gonna do an all over on this quilt, which I wouldn't, but if I were, there's a lot of contrasting colors. I would go with a light gray. I would do a light gray over the whole thing. But since it's for Tula, I knew I was gonna change thread colors, but I didn't wanna change thread colors for every single thing, so I'm trying to find colors that will work over a range. So even in that dark blue, that purple, and that pink, I was able to go with a darker, like a medium kind of gray, and it would work over the range of that. So even if you're gonna switch thread colors, you don't have to do a different one for each. I mean, you can. If you've got all the thread colors and you wanna play with them all, by all means, have fun with it. Sometimes I'll do that. But for the most part, I'm trying to find a thread color that's gonna work over a range. Now, in this particular example, this is a whole cloth that I quilted, and I love to show it because it's a little bit, first of all, it kind of shows my idea of the contrast thing, but it's a little unexpected. So the main focus part was those leaves down the center. Obviously, because it's shiny gold thread, it's pretty hard to miss that, right? But on both sides, it's actually a different thread color than the other leaves, right? So it goes gold, and it goes this other shade, and then this kind of gray. That other shade is actually a purplish gray thread. It's a darker value. It works. Even though it's kind of purple, it's the same value as the background. And same with that dark gray. You know, navy fabric, dark pink fabric, those are the colors I don't always have the same thread color for, but I can go with a medium or a neutral in the same value. So the dark gray still looks really nice on there. So same background, just two different thread options, and they both kind of give you different effects. All right, so here's a perfect example. I found this picture when I was looking through all my pictures about quilting. So if you're gonna do a number of colors because you want it to show up, you know, maybe it's the log cabin with super contrast to it. You know, if that's gonna be the case, we're gonna try to find one that works over a range. So this is from Allison Glass's handiwork line. This was our build a quilt option last year. And so I picked out thread collections. I love doing that, one of my favorites. And so I found, okay, in these three purples, this purplish color will work. And in these two blues, this blue will work. And so I'm trying to kind of look at the sections and then finding a color that will work over it. Now, if we're looking at that same color palette and you're like, I only want to use one, I would choose the light pink, right? Again, it's not white. It's not going to show up too much on there. It's going to show up a little bit more in the dark, but it's going to hit that middle, that range. So, and then here's another perfect example. This was our Urban Grid colorway. For Build a Quilt, you get to pick one of 3 different colorways for your blocks. So I found, you know, like a light linen that would work over these colors, and military gold that worked on this. So look for ranges of color. You can really get a lot of mileage out of your thread. And then here we got, if I'm gonna just pick one, it's gonna be this tannish kind of color. So again, looking towards the value, most of this is kind of dark, a little bit of light, neutral. Even though there's some really fun colors on this quilt, I knew this would be the one that kind of went the range with it. So that kind of breaks it down, like shows you a little bit more of how I'd pick it on how I pick threads on not quilted fabric. Sometimes when you've already see a quilt quilted, it's hard to imagine it. Okay, real quick, I'm gonna answer your questions live, but I wanna show you real quick, these, if you had to start with just a little bit of thread, so that's always a question, especially people that buy long arms from me, they're like, oh, I don't wanna buy all the threads right now. Look to make sure your stash has neutrals in a range of values. So here's my light yellow, of course, this, and my light gray. These are going to be the lighter colors that will really go pretty far on my quilts. Then I have my pink and my green. So again, you saw I like to use the pink. It's a little bit warmer, a little bit darker than the yellow, and then the green is just a little bit cooler version. I mean, this will work on blues and greens and tans, and this will work on any kind of warmer colors like orange and stuff like that. Then I love a good tan or any kind of taupe or something a little darker that's going to be kind of your medium neutral, right? So this could also be a medium gray if you wanted. And then I have my darker gray over here, not my black. This is going to be that dark brown, that shadow. But this color right here is fun. You might think, wow, it's kind of different. It's a greenish kind of gray. So this is going to look good on really any of your darker fabrics, but especially anything that has like a green tint to it. This will kind of get you started. So I put them together as a little set. If you want to buy them, you can check the description box below, or you can pull your own threads and make sure you kind of have that. But once you get to that point, then you can start supplementing with your other colors, right? Maybe I can start adding, you know, more of my peaches and my gold color, maybe a little bit of red, and I can start adding to that. Or maybe I go with my light kind of bright green, mint. I love the mint, so pretty. Of course, what am I saying? I love all the threads. Maybe a light blue. So you can start adding to it depending on the quilts that are coming in. But if you have your neutrals in a range, it's really, really gonna help you quilt a lot of your quilts. Usually starting off, you don't necessarily need, you know, the dark reds or anything like that at that point. So I'm sure lots of questions came through. Jessica looks like she's ready to bring them to me. Real quick, I'm gonna just address a couple things that came up before. Oh, good. This is the question I was going to talk about. So Donna asked, if I'm using glide in the top, what do I use in the bobbin? And a lot of questions about bobbin thread. Okay, so let's kind of address all those in one lump. So you don't have to match thread types or weights in your bobbin. You can mix and match and find what works for you. So if you're using, you know, your glide thread, you have your purple on the top, your beautiful Viking color, you can use that in the bobbin as well. I will say you have to watch the winding process. You don't want that slicker thread to not wind correctly. A well-wound bobbin is the foundation of your quilting, so you do not want a bobbin that's not wound correctly. I use pre-wound bobbins, and they're like a poly wrapped poly, so they have a little bit more of a grab to them, a little bit threadier. And some people even said they like to put so fine in the bobbin. Really, you can do whatever you want. I don't use the same on top and bottom, same glide, but that's just because I use pre-wounds, but I have in the past. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so you can change weights, you can change all that. Maybe we'll do a whole nother thread thing on that. But the question was about the bobbin thread. I forgot it, I'll come back. Oh, what color? So what color bobbin, right? You do all this work to pick the thread color for the top. What about the bobbin thread color? I always match the value of the bobbin to the top. Okay, so let's do a little practice. Doris said she has a red, white, and blue quilt with a navy backing. Should she just go with blue or go crazy? Okay, so knowing what I've said, I probably am not, if I'm gonna do one thread color, I might do, if blue's my favorite, I might do a medium blue or a lighter blue. I might do a lighter red, which is pink, probably not that actually, or maybe a tan or a gray. But what I'm not gonna do is worry about the back. Now, I say this with so much love, you guys, don't take offense, but you can only worry about one side of the quilt. Really, I mean, as you're quilting, you can only concentrate on one side. Pick which one you want to worry about. And if it's the top, then I don't worry that the quilting is going to show up on the backing. So that's what I would tell customers very lovingly, because I don't like to mix up colors. I wouldn't do white on the top and navy on the back, because I'm going to get these little pokies as I quilt, and I know it's not going to look great. So if you know that, and you're like, I don't want the quilting to show up, pick a backing fabric that's a similar color as your quilt top with busy fabric, and you won't see it. Again, I know that's a little bit like, I don't want to say harsh, that's just how I do it. By all means, you can definitely change it up. But for the most part, I'm matching the value to the top. So let's say I was going to use my purple, and I have my pre-wounds in neutrals, I'm gonna probably use a medium gray on the back. And even though they're different, they're the same value, so it's gonna help hide any of those little pokies. So that's kind of how I handle it. Again, everybody's different. You have to do what you like, okay? So just leave that. Do I pick my thread color or quilting design first? Great question. I've never been asked that one before, and I like new questions. It depends. That's always my answer. For the most part, I pick the quilting designs first, but if I'm having trouble picking the quilting designs, then I just skip right onto the thread. I look at the quilt, I decide how am I going to approach the quilt? Am I going to quilt it row by row or block by block? And then I pick designs that make that happen, and then I pick the thread. But sometimes I switch it up too. Maybe I see a quilt and I'm like, ooh, I get to use my military gold thread. I cannot wait. It's going to look great. Maybe that's the case. Real quick before I go to the other ones, a good question was, what about different types of threads? So you have to know that the weight of your thread will also determine how much is going to show up. So if I'm using 100 weight thread, like micro quilter or you know, anything like that, even if it contrasts, it's not going to show up as much. So I can get a little bit more range out of my thread for that. So if you are comfortable with experimenting with different weights, you can play around with that and think, oh, okay, I have this black and white quilt. I'm going to do medium gray, but if I do 80 weight or 100 weight, I know it's going to be even less noticeable. Now on that line, a question came up about monopoly, which is clear thread. I have used it in the past. It definitely disappears. So this is going to be for a quilt where there's lots of thread or fabric colors, and I don't have time to change threads. I don't have the desire to change threads, and I definitely don't want the quilting to overwhelm it. So the perfect example, and I know you can't see what's in my mind, it's probably a good thing, but if you can use your imagination, it was a hand applique quilt with all sorts of colors. I mean, it was like scallops upon scallops. It was like red and it was green, all these colors, and I had to get it done for Quilt Festival. It was for an exhibit. So I did monopoly thread, knowing you're not going to see it. You'll see a little bit of the texture. It's not going to take away from that, you know, hand applique. But for the most part, I don't like using it because I want to see the quilting a little bit. I mean, I like a little bit. But if you don't want to, you can definitely try out a thinner weight thread or monopoly works. What bobbin color would you use in the bottom? I'm just guessing you're thinking that. If I'm going to use monopoly on top, I'm going to pick a bobbin color that is similar to the top, the quilt top. So if I have a red, white, and blue quilt, and I do monopoly on top, then I'm going to do light gray, medium gray in the back. If I kind of assuming if I did pick a thread color, what would I want it to match it to? So what thread would I use for a blackish background with bright 3D colors to make the 3D stand out? I would use thread colors that match all the sections so that you really don't have any of it take away from it. So I would use black. If it's like red, white, and black, I would do red, white, and black. But again, you have to know going in, like that's what I want to show off. That's the most important thing about it, and you'll just do what you have to do to make it show up. Do I ever test the thread first to see what it will look like? This is a great thing you can do. So one thing I'm not great about is testing out stuff. You know, like when you buy like fabric or like rug cleaner or anything, it's like test in an inconspicuous area first. I'm like, oh, I'm just going for it. Well, hopefully it works out. I'm a little impatient in general, so I don't do a lot of testing, but I do have a lot of samples laying around with actual thread on it that I can check out. So yes, you can test it out if you want to be sure. I know a lot of people make a test block. Perfect. Quilt your test block with the thread you want to use, and you can kind of get a range, an idea there. Or you can make yourself a little thread sampler. So I have a quilt that I did for my thread needles and tension class, and I just quilted a row of the same design with some different thread colors, and just gonna let you see what it looks like. But here's the thing, it's not always gonna look the same, right? Because it depends on the background color, so you kind of have to take that into account. So hopefully that helps, I don't know. Okay, another couple questions that came up that I forgot to talk about. Jennifer had a great one. What if you can't open the thread in the quilt shop, or you're buying online? So it sucks, right? Because you want to see the thread out, you want to kind of audition it, you want to look at it, but we're not going to probably let you open a spool of thread just to unwind it. So if that's the case, you kind of have to look at the spool. Let's say I'm working with this gray, and I'm like, I think this is going to work. I have to know that it's not going to be this dark on it. It's going to just be one thread. So in that case, I know that's going to be a little deceiving what I see here. And so I think, okay, again, I think it's going to be close. I'll go, you know, maybe a shade lighter. If the shop quilts for customers like we do, we have tons of open bobbins. We can kind of look them out and compare. Or a good option would be to grab a thread card. The thread cards are nice because it shows you all the different colors. And again, I can't pull the individual pieces out, but if I know that I have pale mist or blue, I can kind of look and see, okay, what colors over here are darker or lighter. So it kind of gives you a good reference, and it's just kind of fun to look at. So that will help you. Again, it's a hit or miss type of thing, just like buying fabric. So again, but if you aim for that neutral in that value, I promise you're going to be fine. So that's a lot of talking about thread, and if you're still watching, I'm very, very excited that you are. I could go on about thread for days. I love talking about thread. We didn't even get into like tension and all that other kind of stuff, but just know, if I'm going to sum it up, if you're looking at your quilt, there's no wrong answer. And if you want to play it safe, just go for a neutral in the value of the quilt and you're going to be good to go. But if you want to branch out, try some different colors. And ultimately, the more you quilt, the better you'll get at knowing what you like and what you think looks good, okay? So just feel assured that that's the case. And don't forget, there's that free downloadable PDF version of the presentation, so you can get that as well. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'd love to answer them and make sure everybody's doing okay with it, but ultimately, there's no wrong answer. That's the one good thing about quilting. There's no wrong answers. Anyway, I'll be back next week for another live chat. I hope until then, everybody stays safe and has a great, great weekend. Until then, happy quilting, everybody.